One of the things that I feel like has been on the rise and has become more and more of a problem probably within the last decade or two in our culture is identity theft. It's interesting to hear the way that identity theft is now, and for some of you may not be real familiar. It's talked about quite a bit. Some people may not know how that works. By someone kind of illicitly obtaining your social security number or your driver's license, credit card numbers, even passwords to social media, like a person's identity can actually be stolen, and then in that person's name, they can purchase things or apply for credit cards or even apply for things like medical care and things like that, often incurring thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars of debt, which can have very damaging consequences for people. And so in the last 10 years or so, we have seen identity theft kind of skyrocket to the point that it is now, because you probably hear on the radio and things like that, identity theft protection a lot of time is talked on par with like auto insurance and homeowners insurance. Like now it's considered something that just everybody should have because it's so much a part of our world, and we see it continuing to be on the upswing. There was 15.4 million people who had their identity stolen in 2016. That's a 50% rise from the previous year. In fact, the way those statistics are going, during the course of my message, 30-ish minute message that I'm going to speak this morning, there will be someone about every 2 seconds having their identity stolen. So by the end of my message, 1,000 people will have their identity stolen by the end of my sermon this morning. So now many of these breaches can be, real devastating and have all kinds of serious consequences, but some of them are just kind of silly. Some of them are just kind of idiotic in a lot of ways. I was reading an article about several different, just kind of almost hilarious forms of identity theft. And one story was about this 33-year-old woman who actually stole her daughter's identity in order to enroll in high school and join the cheerleading squad. Her name is Wendy Brown of Green Bay, Wisconsin. And according to the criminal complaint filed, she faces felony identity theft charges after enrolling in a local high school as her 15-year-old daughter. Now, you see the picture, it's like, can she pass as 15? I don't know. But she did. Like, she actually, went on record where she joined the cheerleading squad and, even went to a pool party with the cheerleading team at the cheerleading coach's house and had her own locker and everything like that. I guess her daughter lived down in Nevada with her grandmother. And so, she, in the report, it said she felt like she had missed out on an important part of her life. So she literally stole her daughter's identity in order to enroll in high school. Another story, a man named Lee Ming, a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, feeling that he had no way out of staggering credit card debt, faked his own death. Complete with a legit obituary in the local paper, literally forged his own death. 9 months later, he attempted to obtain a new driver's license with the intention, surprisingly enough, or unsurprisingly enough, to apply for more credit cards. However, the DMV that he visited, they were kind of unaccustomed to issuing driving privileges to dead people, so they called the authorities. So, subsequently, Lee Ming was arrested for stealing the identity of himself. You see, we now live in a world where people don't just steal what you have, they steal who you are. And though it's been kind of on the rise and there's new inventive ways to do that, it's really not that new of a thing. It's actually quite an old idea, because the truth is, every time a person forgets who God has created them to be, they begin to live a lie. They exchange the truth for a lie. Every time I believe what someone else says about me rather than what God says about me, I am robbed of who I am. And so today we're starting this series called Living a Lie. And we are exploring over the next 3 weeks the 3 most believable lies that shape who we are. And each one can devastate you just as much as the next. And so here's actually where I want to start with this. Rather than going right into the lie and talking about all that, what I want to do is just to kind of lay a foundation for where we're going to go. I want to talk about the truth first. Because here's the truth, and I want you guys to remember this. This is why this is the first point of my message. Because if you don't know who you are, you won't know when you're living a lie. If you don't know who you are, you won't know when you're living a lie. It's almost like your bank account in a lot of ways. Like, how do you know if someone is stealing from you or not? By knowing how much money you have. If you know exactly how much is in your account, then you're able to see when the numbers begin to change, something weird is going on. Something odd is happening that I might want to call my bank and look into that. If you don't know who you are, you won't know when you're living a lie. See, in the same way, our foundation has to be deeply and firmly rooted in who we are in God. And see, the only person who genuinely showed us that in the totality is, of course, Jesus. Jesus modeled to us not only who God is himself, but who we are to God. And so we're going to take a look, just a brief look at kind of the foundation to be laid for who we are to God in Matthew chapter 3, verse 16. The story goes like this. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water, and at that moment heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Now, I can't emphasize how important this particular verse is. What the Father says to Jesus right here when we are in him. See, even when we were created by God, this was the truth about us, that we are the beloved of God. Nothing else captures the essence of how God views you, that you are the beloved of God, loved without limit and without condition, that was our condition at our creation. Humans were the beloved of God. When Adam was created, he was the beloved of God. But of course, sin enters into the world and mars that and makes us forget and believe all sorts of lies about who we are. And we're going to be talking about these throughout. But Jesus, who is called the second Adam, comes onto the scene, lives the sinless life, lives the type of life that pleases God. And so what he hears is, "This is my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." Apart from anything you've done or anything you'll ever do, you are loved by God. And what I think is interesting is the timing of this little statement that the Father makes to Jesus, because he doesn't say it to him at the end of his ministry when he's done all these amazing things, preached all these amazing sermons, performed all these miracles. He says it at the beginning of his ministry, before he's taught a single sermon, before he's performed a single miracle, before he's healed a single person. He says, "Jesus, I want you to know that you are my Son and I love you. With you I am well pleased before you've done anything for me. I love you." That is who you are. And so it should be no surprise to us, because we hear this truth. We know this is the foundation of who God, how God views us, how God sees us. It should be no surprise to us that lies begin to enter into the world to threaten that truth, to question that truth, to test that truth. And it's no different for Jesus as well. In Matthew 4, literally the next story in the Gospels, it says this: "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, 'If you are the Son of God.'" Now, this is all three temptations shown in this story start in the same way of saying, if you are the Son of God, where he's saying you just got called the beloved of God. He says, if that's true, then do this, do that. He goes on, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." And so we see in this first temptation, we see a lie presented to Jesus that is as old as sin, because he says, if you are the Son of God, if you claim to be the beloved of the Father, prove it. Do something to show your worth and value. Show us that you have earned that title, because the only way that you can be the beloved of the Father is by earning it. Turn these stones to bread. Show me and everyone else in the world that you can do it. You have to earn that title. So what is he saying? What is this question in a nutshell? Your value and your worth and your identity are somehow attached to your behavior. And so with these words, with this question, with this challenge, we are presented front and center with one of the greatest lies in history, which is the lie of performance. I am what I do. This lie tells you that your worth and your value are determined by your behavior, that your identity isn't tied intrinsically to who you are, but rather what you accomplish. I am what I do. So if you perform well, if you achieve, if you produce, you are worth something. You're successful. You mean something to the world. But if you don't, if you fail, if you stumble, if you mess up, you can kiss away that title of beloved, because that title is reserved only for winners. And so this was the temptation that was presented before Jesus. What would he base his worth and value on? Because if you think about it, this temptation to turn stones into bread, that is probably one of the most useful temptations, one of the most useful things that he could do. Because imagine turning something as common and as useless as a rock into food. How useful would that be? Cure world hunger. Never again would a child go to sleep hungry. Never again would a family starve. And it wouldn't cost Jesus anything. He'd just wave his hand like a Jedi and turn it into bread. Show everyone and yourself why you deserve to be called the Son of God. Earn it. And see, it's this type of view of interacting with God that is a lot more common than we think. In a lot of ways, we actually order a lot of our relationships with this lie of performance. Because I was thinking about this, of just how exhausting living by this lie is. Because you even think about the idea of a first date. I hated first dates because there was so much pressure, so much banking on this first date of like, I got to be very, like, what am I going to wear? What's my hair going to look like? Or where am I going to take her? Like, what is she going to think of where I take her? And what are we going to talk about? It's like everything is banking on like, it's almost like an interview for a job. Where you feel like I have to put my best foot forward and show that I am somehow worthy. I am somehow earning this right to be with you, and it's just simply exhausting. And so you have to learn things about, like, what do I talk about? What do I not talk about? How am I supposed to answer? Like, and then of course I learned really early on that, under no circumstances and by no means do you talk about Star Wars on the first date. Like, you just don't do it. That's more like a fourth or fifth year of marriage type of thing to talk about. Like, it was a while before I told Lindsay about my, this nerddom that I had, hidden within me because I wanted her to stick around. In some ways, it's like I had to pretend like it's like we do that on first dates, job interviews, things like that. Like, we sometimes almost kind of present ourselves a certain way, sometimes maybe even pretend we're something that we're not in order to make a good first impression. And the same thing occurs with our spiritual lives. There's an author, David Benner, a Christian author, speaker, psychologist, and he talks about this idea in a book that he wrote called Surrender to Love. And a question he asks right at the beginning of the book, where he said a good way that he figures out how people believe God views them is he asks them this question when he would meet with people. He would ask this question, and the question was this: when God thinks about you, what's the first word that comes to mind? Not when you think about God. When God thinks about you, what is the first word that comes to mind? And he says almost universally the two words that people bring up is disappointed and angry. That's how a majority of people, and a lot of these people are Christians, think God views them. God is disappointed with them. God is angry with them. And when we begin to view God through that lens, this is what he writes at the beginning of Surrender to Love. He states it like this: the central feature of any spiritual response to such a God will be an effort to earn his approval. Far from daring to relax in his presence, you will be vigilant to perform as well as you possibly can, and the motive for any obedience you might offer will be fear rather than love, and there will be little genuine surrender. See, when we begin to live the lie, I am what I do, my focus is irrevocably pulled away from being before God to doing for God. And all of it is to earn his love. So when we're faced with God, with this kind of lie right in front of our face, that believing this lie that I am what I do, when we begin to swallow that lie wholeheartedly, we tend to respond before God in one of two different ways. And I've seen this, I see it in the scripture, and I've seen it just in the 10 plus years of ministry I've been in. I've seen this response over and over again, that there is a kind of a spiritual fight or flight response that occurs, that we either respond automatically and try to earn, or we respond and try to run. And so people kind of fall into two camps. One camp that people tend to fall into when they feel like they have to earn God's love is they fall into the legalism of the religious. Gotta try harder, gotta strive more, gotta go through all of my religious rituals and things, and gotta cross all my T's and dot all my I's, or God will be angry at me. And then on the other side is the license of the hedonist. Now, you may not know what that word means. A hedonist is someone who is a lover of pleasure, where you've probably heard that term like, let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That is kind of the anthem call of the hedonist. Like, I know that I failed God, so I might as well just live it up while I have this time on earth. Now, both of these sound like they're like completely polar opposite reactions from each other, but guess what? They are actually both the same thing. One lie wrapped into two different masks. Because see, both the legalist and the hedonist believe that I am defined by what I do. And so the legalist meticulously monitors their actions, striving and hoping it will be enough to please the watching eye of a God who is constantly scrutinizing their behavior, while the hedonist on the other side knows that they'll never be good enough, so they might as well just enjoy every single bit of pleasure there is to gain while on this earth. See, though they seem to be opposite behaviors, they are rooted in the same lie. It's a belief that, somehow my standing before God is firmly rooted in how I act or don't act, how I, live or not live. And they are both living a lie. They are both falling into the same trap. But little do they know that there actually is another way, that God himself has shown us another way rather than these two different paths. And see, Jesus actually gives us this other way in Luke 15. He begins to tell a parable, begins to tell a story to the crowd. But I'm going to set up in the first two verses. He gives a little bit of a setting so we know who the audience is who is hearing this story. In Luke 15, 1 and 2, it says this: "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Now, that first verse is important because it's literally setting the context for why this story is being told, because we see in these first two verses that those two groups are present. Tax collectors and sinners kind of represent the license of the hedonist. People that were considered, they're too far away from God. They've done too much. They're too far gone. There's no way God could ever love them. And then on the other side is the legalism of the religious, the Pharisees, the the teachers of the law, those types of things. These people who are supposedly doing everything that they're supposed to do. And yet Jesus always kind of talked about them in a way that there was something missing. And so this is the scene that he sits in. He begins to tell several parables, one about a lost sheep and one about a lost coin. And really these stories are just kind of building up to one final story that little did they know the point that Jesus was going to make with this. And in verse 11, he starts out this last story in this way. It says, "Jesus continued, 'There was a man who had 2 sons.'" See, the crowd had no idea where he was going to go with this story. And of course, for those of you who grew up with it, you kind of know where Jesus goes, where Jesus takes this story. The younger son of the 2 asks his father for his inheritance, which in the ancient world was kind of saying, "Hey, Dad, I wish you were dead. And I'm just going to take it and I'm going to run off and just kind of live this crazy life." Verse 13, it says, "Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth on wild living." And that is the picture of the hedonist. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That is the spiritual flight, the running away, saying, I must have already failed in some sort of way, and there's no way I can ever live under my Father, and so instead I'm just going to get as far away from him as possible, and many of us do this. That is the picture of the hedonist. And so there's a part of me that's always kind of wondered, how does a person get to the point where they literally just kind of implode their life and just run away from everything? Have you ever thought about that? Some of you may have family members who have done those types of things, and you may have kind of wondered, like, how did the person get to the point that they would do that? I was reading an interesting study done by a Duke professor. His name is Dan Aurelia. He actually wrote a book about the study he did at Duke, and the book is called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, How We Lie to Everyone, Including Ourselves. And it's not a Christian book. It's not a Christian study. But it's interesting, even from like a secular perspective, him capturing the damage that sin does on the mind and the soul and how it erodes away our integrity, leading to kind of this collapse. And so in the study, he points out that there are kind of two primary desires that drive our behavior. The first desire is we want selfish gain. We want things that we want, whether they're good for us or not, we want them. But the other desire is we also want to be thought of by others and ourselves to essentially be good people. So it's like, I want what I want, but I also want people to think I'm a good person. And so we're constantly living between these two tensions. And so what ends up happening is we give in to these little dishonesties. Not enough to be considered a big deal, but just enough so I can get what I want and still rationalize my behavior into thinking that I'm a good person. And so we say little things like, oh, well, it was the traffic that held me up when it wasn't really the traffic. Or, oh, no, I sent that email when the truth is I didn't actually send that email. I forgot. But see, here's what he found. These little dishonesties erode our integrity over time. And it makes it easier and easier to give into bigger dishonesties over time. So eventually, when our mind can no longer rationalize our behavior as being good, instead what we do is moral behavior simply collapses and we just fully give in to our desires. Probably a great example that we've maybe all at times experienced before is if you've ever done a diet before and you just think like, oh, I'm just going to cheat a little bit here and there and it's not a big deal. But then you find that kind of eroding into a whole weekend of binge eating. Anybody ever done that before? See, this is why we see within scandal-ridden companies like Enron, the Madoff funds, they don't start out as these huge things. It starts out as, I'm just going to borrow just a little bit of money from, this particular retirement fund and use it for my benefit, and I'm going to pay it back. Like, they'll never know it was gone. But little by little, it kind of erodes away to where they get to the part where they're like, you know what? It's like, I'm not even going to like try to rationalize my behavior anymore, and I'm just embezzling money. That erodes over time and kind of snowballs. And so here's what's interesting about it. Aurelia writes this. He says that the mind begins to think, well, I've already blown it, so I might as well just give in fully. Like, you ever thought that before? Like, well, I already messed up, like I might as well just give into it completely. And so there's actually a name that the social sciences has given to this kind of effect of like, well, I messed up, so I might as well give into it. And you know what it's called? It's called the what the hell effect. Such interesting language. See, that is the condition of the sin-sick soul. What the hell? And so I just give in and give in more until I find myself so far away from what I thought I could be. And I get to the point that I don't even care anymore. What the hell? Such interesting language. And so this is the condition of the younger son. All moral behavior is collapsed, and so he just goes off to a foreign country and engages in what's called wild living. But of course, after a very short time, which is typically how these things go, he quickly realizes that this type of life doesn't work, that the spiritual flight doesn't work. So in verse 17 it says, when he came to his senses, so he's like, okay, this isn't panning out like I thought it would. He says, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Now, I want you to notice something about his response. Even after coming to his senses, even after deciding to come home, he's still believing the lie. Because he starts coming up with this elaborate thing like, okay, I'm going to come up with this strategy of like, no, I know I'm not going to be your son anymore. I know I'm not good enough to be your son. So instead I'll work for you for a while. Just be like one of your servants. And maybe possibly in the future I could work my way up back to the way things were. That he still has in his mind that his behavior is the primary determinant of his status before his father. But we see in verse 20, and I love the way this goes. It says, so he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Now, I want you to notice at this point, his son had said nothing yet. He had his well-prepared speech, his gloriously laid plans of how he was going to make amends and work real hard to make up for it. And he can't even get that plan through his lips before his father just runs up, runs down the road and hugs him and embraces him. But he still tries to get it out. It says, the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. I love this next word. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. So he's like still trying to get out his speech. And it says, but the father said, he's like, oh, okay, yeah. Hey, let's get a feast going. Like, it's like he doesn't even listen to what his son's saying. Like, you don't need to do that. You don't need to have this whole plan formed out of how you're going to do this, that I receive you back because I love you. And so in this moment, the younger son is faced with the harsh reality of the lie he has been living. Before he can even get a word out, get out his little speech, his father receives him and accepts him and restores him and throws a big party to celebrate on his behalf. See, that is the power of grace. That is the power of God's love. Now, the thing about this story is we often stop here and just talk about, for those who are prodigal sons and prodigal daughters who have gone far off, God will receive you and you just have to come home and that type of thing. We stop here, but we don't remember that at the very beginning of the story, Jesus starts the story saying there was a father who had two sons. This isn't a story about one son. This is a story about two sons. That there's a very important part. The story continues with the older son finding out that his younger brother has returned home and been openly received, and he is furious. Verse 28. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. I want you to listen to this language. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered his father, look, all these years I have been slaving for you. Is that how a child is supposed to talk about their parents? All these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. And yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with all my friends. But when this son of yours, notice he doesn't even call him his brother. And we all have that moment as parents when we say, have you seen what your daughter just did? Did you hear what your son just said to me? It's like by using that language, we are creating relational distance. Our anger does that, relational distance, by saying, this son of yours, this child of yours, did you hear what your son said to me? Is that me? My beard's not as glorious as it used to be, so I don't know what the deal is. But he says, but when this son of yours who had squandered your property with prostitutes came home, you killed the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we have to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. Now, in the Bible, in your Bible, like if you have a physical Bible with you, or even if you have like YouVersion on your phone, we have these headings over these stories. And if you have a newer translation, it probably says like the parable of the lost son. But if you grew up in church, you know that a lot of times the story was called something different. It was called the parable of the what son? The prodigal son. And we kind of use those words interchangeably. If someone's a prodigal, it's someone who has strayed wayward. They're lost. They're not on the track they're supposed to be on. We said, oh, that person's a prodigal, but someday they'll come home. But do you know what the word prodigal actually means? It means extravagantly wasteful. And you got to wonder, which son was Jesus actually talking about in the story? Because, yeah, it's true, the younger son wasted his inheritance on wild living. But the older son wasted his inheritance by doing nothing with it. Because he said, I slaved for you, and you never even gave me a goat to celebrate with my friends. And the father's saying, all this time, everything I have had is yours. Why have you not made use of it? It has always been available to you. Why did you feel like you couldn't? See, in the most unexpected way possible, Jesus showed his audience that both sons, in fact, were missing it. Both sons were, in fact, prodigals. Both sons were, in fact, lost, but for very different reasons. One was consumed with the good life, wasting his inheritance on lavish, what the hell kind of living, while the other wasted it, towing the line, always being the good son, always trying to earn his father's love and approval through his behavior. One was consumed by his desires, the other was consumed by his self-righteousness. And both missed the all-important fact that their status, their inherent status as sons, had nothing to do with what they did or didn't do. And so it's with this amazing story, Jesus makes this point that just kind of lands home for everybody who is listening in the audience. For the tax collectors and sinners, he was letting them know, you can come home. The religious leaders may have told you you're too far from God, but you can come home. There is always a way to come home. And to the religious leaders, he was telling them, you're missing it, but you don't have to miss it. You have everything God has for you available to you, but you are wasting it by not using it the way that God created you to. That if you let go of your spiritual pride, if you let go of your self-righteousness, you can join in the party just like everybody else. See, Jesus wanted to introduce to them the most important concept about the nature of the Father, and that is the way of grace. That I am not what I do. That I am the beloved of the Father simply because that is who God has declared me to be. Now, of course, grace requires a response. Grace says to the younger son, if you may be the younger son in this room, that grace says to the younger son that there is always a way home, but guess what? You actually have to come home. You can't keep living in a foreign land. You must come home. The Father wants you to be with him. To the older sons, he says that you need to receive the goodness and grace that has always been there, always available at your fingertips, but you need to be able to receive it and allow it to change you, that you let go of your spiritual pride, to let go of your self-righteousness, that somehow you deserve to be where you're at because of your goodness and righteousness and obedience. See, this is what Dallas Willard meant when he said, grace is not opposed to effort. It is opposed to earning. Action is required of us, just not to earn. That when we live for God, when we respond to God, when we live in his kingdom and live according to his ways, it is not to earn his favor or to earn our place at the table, but it is instead an overflow, a reaction of an already established decree that I have a place at the table, that I am the beloved of God, and so I live out of that rather than trying to earn it. See, the Father has invited each of us to partake in the divine life with him, to be part of this great kingdom celebration that he is bringing about. And so we have a choice. Each of us, just like the two sons then had. Do I, like the younger son, run from God because of my failures and pursue my own pleasures? Or maybe like the other son, the older son, do I try to make up for my failings with spiritual pride, with self-righteousness, and try to achieve what God has already given me freely through his son Jesus? Why are you trying to earn something that has already been given to you? Can I let go of the lie, I am what I do? Because be assured, when God thinks about you, every single one of you in this room, when God thinks about you, you know what the first word that comes to mind is? Love. Amen? Will you stand with me? I want to give a response, a chance to respond for everybody in this room. Because I think the story that Jesus told applies to any of us and all of us. That some of you right now, you are the younger son. You are the one that you're just kind of like, what's the point? I've already failed. I might as well just fully give into it. And so you have just been running from God for a really, really long time. And you think, I'm too far gone. I've done too much. There's no way that God could receive me back. And I want to let you know, Jesus himself said, there's always a way home back to the Father. But you got to come home. You can't keep living in a foreign land. You got to come home and allow him to restore you, to change you, to replace you back into the status that you had as his beloved son or daughter. Some of you, and I think it might be more than you think, maybe you grew up in church, maybe you've served in some prominent position for a long time within the church, and there's spiritual pride there. There's a sense of self-righteousness of like, no, I am where I am because I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps. I did it myself, and so I'm here because I earned this. And I say, woe to you. Woe to you. That is the type of language the Pharisees used, and Jesus called them sons of hell. See, we need to realize if you're the older son type of person that you don't deserve to be at the table any more than the younger son has. The only reason why you can be there is simply because the Father calls you beloved and that his Son has made a way, that your righteousness, according to the prophet Isaiah, is like filthy rags before God. You're never going to be good enough. So let go of your pride. So maybe you grew up in the church and you always thought you're walking right with God, and you look down on your nose at all these dirty sinners around you and you realize everything has always been available to me from the Father, but I have been wasting it, caught up in my own self-righteousness. So we're going to sing a song here in a moment that declares who we are before God, declares our identity of us being the beloved before God. And so as we sing this song, I want to invite our ministry leaders to come forward to pray for people that if you fall in either of those categories, younger son or older son, and you realize, man, I need to walk the path of grace. I need to come home. I need to begin to lay hold of all that God has for me. If you want someone to pray with you this morning, we're up here. We would love to pray with you. We would love to help you find your way back to the Father. Find your way back to that place where you know without the shadow of a doubt, I am the beloved of God. So respond as God leads you, and then I'll come back up and close out the service.